today to talk about the review and the documents that we asked Mr. Murdoch to do the investigation.
I think you're gonna have to talk louder.
Yeah, I think you, if, can you speak
Get
up?
the more stuff, okay. Okay.
I should say in the way of introduction that because Mr. Murdoch traveled here from California, what we asked him to do was to spend 2 full days here in Austin, and gave him the opportunity yesterday to meet with both laboratories that had cases that he examined. The idea behind that was to allow for question and answer, to give the laboratories an opportunity to comment on his findings, both in terms of the factual recitation as well as the substantive technical conclusions that he made. And I know that in both cases, there were clarifying points made and lots of discussion, and I think certainly in the case of the panel we did yesterday, which was in Swift's case, there was a lot of, I think, really helpful and productive conversation about the status of the discipline and different things that should be taken into account and where the discipline's going and all sorts of things. So I imagine you had similar conversation with IFL yesterday in the morning, right, from 9 to 10:30?
Yes, we did.
Is there anything that came out of there in the form of a clarification that the panel may not have here in the binders, or is it pretty much everything that's here?
No, I think there was a lot of clarification that came out of yesterday's meeting, and I can summarize it pretty shortly, and we have representatives here from the laboratory, including Paul, who was the examiner. So whenever you'd like me to do that.
I say go for it.
Go for it,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
I think we were
Okay.
just talking a little about that, but just I think you should go.
The initial series of questions that I received from the commission suggested that Paul Slocum used the bunter marks. Now, the bunter, just for purposes of definition, is the tool at the factory that the factory uses to impress the head stamp on the cartridge cases. It is what we call a class characteristic. It is not an individual characteristic, and it cannot be used to associate a fired cartridge case with the firearm that was used to fire it. So when Paul received these, he received approximately 25 questioned cartridge cases from the scene of a police shooting. And he received 5 semi-automatic pistols that were alleged or reported to have been used. Since they were all the same make and model of semi-automatic pistol, they were made by Sig Sauer, and the model is P226. They leave very similar markings on fired cartridge cases. And so he was faced with a group of 25. During his examination, he noticed a pretty apparent anomaly in the head stamp design of a couple of either letters or numbers. And so he went through and thought maybe each officer had their own box of ammunition. And perhaps, although a lot of times there is a mixture of bunter marks in any given box of ammunition, sometimes they're very similar in that they were produced by the same bunting tool at the factory. So I think he used a lot of ingenuity by thinking, okay, if I group these by bunter marks, perhaps I will have, by class characteristic, associated them with one box and therefore with one officer. And so he did. He grouped them into a series of groups. He then began to compare these groups with the guns. And lo and behold, when he went through the first 4 guns, one gun was determined by individual characteristics, not by the bunter marks. By comparison of test firings with the group, he determined that, for example, Group 1 bunter marks the gun number 1 was used to fire that. Group 2 bunter marks, the firearm number 2 was used. Group 3, firearm 3, Group 4, firearm 4. And then he got to Group 5. And he experienced some difficulty comparing gun number 5 with group number 5. And he spent several days doing that, which he then had to set aside because he experienced a personal tragedy in his life. His father passed away. And so he had to deal with that tragedy, with arrangements and so on. And then he returned to the laboratory. And I have a feeling that, I know I experienced a similar tragedy a few years back, and although he might have been there physically, he might not have been there mentally. So here he was back with Group 5, and what he failed to do is to go back and say, okay, since I'm experiencing difficulty with gun 5, with Group 5 of the bunter marked cartridge cases, maybe Group 5 was fired by guns 1, 2, 3, and 4. He did not go back and compare those. So, since he couldn't find any positive association in individual characteristics with gun 5, he simply reported in his notes that he had eliminated Group 5 cartridge cases with guns 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, failing to go back and compare Group 5 cartridge cases with guns 1 through 4. The statement appears on a numbered page in his notes that he did this elimination. If you go to the report is virtually verbatim from the notes. So it's clear to me, as an outside reviewer, that he made a conclusion in his notes. And when I inquired about the justification, I determined that there was really no justification, which caused me to wonder about the technical review. Ron Fazio, who was here yesterday, did the technical review. And I asked Ron, I said, did you know about these other comparisons, this grouping by bunter marks that Paul Slocum had done? And he said yes. So he knew of this background comparison and separation by bunter marks, even though there isn't a word in the case notes about that separation process, which there should have been. It would have been easy to craft a page and say, okay, the following question cartridge cases, because they were all numbered, are in Group 1 by bunter mark. The following are in Group 2, Group 3, Group 4, Group 5. And it would have been pretty straightforward to go through and make up a matrix with those. But I couldn't find anything in the notes that dealt with that. The technical reviewer knew of that separation process. And because of the background knowledge, I suppose this is why he didn't question that conclusionary statement that appeared in Mr. Slocum's notes. Because as an outsider, when I read that conclusionary statement, I asked myself the question immediately, okay, what's the basis of this exclusion? Ron didn't ask for that because he felt that he knew. And if it were me, I would have said, okay, what's the basis? Now that I know it, I want you to put it in your notes because that's where it belongs. It's clear, based on just general knowledge and all the attachments that I have, that the basis for any conclusion must be in the notes.
So is it fair to say the notes was not complete? There wasn't any SOP for it. There was not any notes, and the technical reviewer did not have enough information to technically review this case.
Based on the case file?
Based on the case file.
Based on the case file, that's correct. But still, even armed,
Even if he had the information, he didn't ask for that.
that's correct.
Okay.
And even armed with the background information, I would have liked for the technical reviewer to go to Paul and say, well, okay, you can't match up Group 5 cartridge cases with gun 5. Can you match them up with guns
Any
1
of
through
those.
4? And he apparently did not ask that question.
So The question, another question that they did some audit and they went back and checked the cases. So the technical reviewer was the same person.
Yes.
And, and it is, at least we feel that was not the right person to do the audit for those cases.
Well, judging from the performance of the technical reviewer in the case under consideration, if he didn't ask for clarification in this case, he might not have asked for clarification in other cases. I don't know if that's the case, but just that we only have one case to go by, and the circumstances were a little bit unusual because of the necessity for Paul to be gone for a period of time.
So how do you handle tech reviews in firearms sections, or I'm sorry, not tech reviews, really, that's not the question. How do you handle retroactive case reviews or audits in a firearms section or any other section that has a small number of analysts? Say 2 or something like that. Send it out? Who pays for that? Et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I know that it doesn't come up very often, and I know that especially I work in the Bay Area in California, and there are a lot of forensic laboratories in California. And they have the California Association of Criminalists, so people tend to know each other because most people join those professional associations. We also have the Association of Firearm and Tool Mark Examiners, and they have very well-crafted annual seminars, and they also have very well-crafted social hours. So the people get to know each other quite a bit, and there's a collegial environment because of those activities. And we have sent some cases out to the fellow that I teach with, whose name is Bruce Moran, for example. He has done several cases that came from our laboratory that are sent up to him with the permission of the laboratory director. There's been no fee involved. It's just been a collegial kind of a, yes, I'll let my examiner spend whatever time is necessary to review this case and write a report. So that's how we have handled it.
There may also be some other smaller laboratories around that have the same problem, and then they can just have they can review for each other too, and then there wouldn't be a charge because they both have the same problem.
Yes.
I think in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, there may be a couple other firearms examiners who are in a similar situation, so that may be an option for them in those circumstances.
So y'all do firearms, and the Emmy and Tarrant County does firearms, and
Well, then
Fort Worth
there's,
PD does fire.
Dallas
so-
PD's got
And Dallas PD.
somebody, and then
Harris
there's
County
a couple
does.
there are 2 or 3 independents that are out there that might also
Yeah.
cover for each other.
And then there is the cure-all answer to everybody's woes always, which is DPS, right?
Oh, yeah, I didn't bring it up, you know, so I was trying to give them a break here, but I think some of the others cover for each other, so there may be some other options when you run into a circumstance where you've got a problem,
And,
when there's only 2 people.
and if you have a lot of those cases, you can basically give them to a few of those labs, like just divide them and
Divide them up.
divide them up so not to be burden for any of
If
them.
it's a big volume, then you
Yeah.
have to do something different.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask the IFL people that are here if I correctly interpreted, correctly presented what was discussed yesterday.
Oh, the only thing I'd add is Ron was not the only one that reviewed the cases. Elise Watts was also involved in the review of the cases as well.
Tech review?
Not necessarily the tech report, she did assist with the review.
With the audit.
Oh, the
So
audit.
the cases and reviewing them, reviewing the circumstances of the cases. Like if it was one gun, one bullet, you know, I was able to just look at that and say that this is a straightforward case rather than a complicated case.
Right. I'm trying to remember, because you sent us a spreadsheet on who did the audit work. At some point, we had a conference call, I remember, with ASCOT Lab and talked about that. But the firearms examiners did most of those, right?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Okay.
you have a new person too, right? Who's a firearms examiner?
We have, two new firearms
Two,
examiner
okay.
and a trainee.
That's more than I thought there was one new plus a
One
trainee. So there's a
trainee.
total
Well,
of,
during the audit, there was one, yes.
so there's a total of 3 who are doing casework and 1 who's training, or 2 who are doing casework and 1 that's training?
At the current time,
Mhm.
We have one examiner doing casework with one technician assisting,
Okay.
and we have, a new examiner starting on the 24th.
Who will be doing casework, independent casework?
Yes.
And the technician, I'm sorry, for my ignorance, but their role is to prep the,
Their role is basically case prep, photo documentation of the packaging and, prepping the case for the examiner
okay.
to do the actual comparable work.
So I have a question. So how many of these examiners are like eligible to do the testing? Their proficiency test has been done with them.
We have one examiner on hand right now that's a true firearms examiner that's been there for.
So there is one right now with the, and the new one that comes is not going to be ready probably for sometimes.
Well, he's trained, he's been trained since
Yeah.
2006, he comes on board with us on the 24th. But he will have to go
Through the
through
whole
some
training, yeah.
efficiency and competency testing once he comes on board.
So if you're concerned with those cases, that needs to be, previous cases, they need to go quicker. Just, that's, or just whatever the lab make a decision.
So I think, John, that you did a very good job describing, I mean, we had said this stuff about the bunner marks, and the way you've described it, I think we should probably clarify that in the factual section, or when the commission writes its report, make sure that the level of detail and information that y'all shared yesterday is accurate and.
May I add one more thing?
Sure, of course.
All of the cases from the particular agency that was involved with this were retested.
Retested, so the case files weren't just audited, they were actually re-examined.
The evidence was resubmitted to the lab, and they were reworked completely by our other examiner.
Mhm. And there were no, from what I recall, there were no discrepancies between the initial reports that were issued and the new reports, is that right?
there was one that needed a little bit more documentation.
But that was, but no substantive,
No
like,
change.
right, okay.
There was only one case that not come back to us, and it was with the FBI lab at the time, and it was not able to be resubmitted.
And that's for that particular client?
Yes.
Okay. So, John, the issue about, making sure you include the basis for your conclusions in the notes, I have to imagine there was consensus on that
Yes.
point. And then, I think you had just a couple of recommendations. So on the issue of the article that we received about bunner marks, what do they mean? Do you feel comfortable that the laboratory understands about bunner marks and what they mean and what they don't, and their limitations and all that?
Yes.
Well, that's,
That's good.
Yes.
do you wanna talk about the worksheets that you looked at a little bit?
Sure.
The inconclusive and elimination verification sheets?
Yeah, the laboratory, this is question 2 in my report on page 3. The laboratory conducted a root cause analysis and implemented corrective actions, including permutation worksheets and verification worksheets. And they say these are for complex cases involving multiple firearms. Are these worksheets sufficient to address the issue? Should they be implemented at other labs for similarly complex cases? Why or why not? My response is that the permutation worksheet is okay as is and would be useful for helping to ensure that all possible comparisons have either been made or at least considered. So I think it's a reasonable thing to do. Any form, I'm a big fan of form use in our work, because although some people might say, well, I always remember to do this, I always consider this, there are cases we don't always do things that we're supposed to do. So forms are a real good prompt, but I'm the first one to say that we're not slaves to forms. If the form doesn't require half of the entries, then you don't need to worry about them. Put NA or draw a line through it. But I think they're very useful, so I like the permutation worksheet. Anything to be more organized and thorough is good. But I had some reservations about the inconclusive elimination verification worksheet. It appeared to me that the only results possible were either neither nor or elimination. And I think it's reasonable to say that most examiners in our country use the AFTE range of conclusions, and I included those as attachment 10. And pointed out that there are 3 conclusions under the heading of inconclusive that are supposed to be used in cases where the examiner does not have either enough agreement to identify or sufficient differences to eliminate. I happen to have been the chairman of the AFTE committee that formulated the range of conclusions, and I know that it was not the intent to ever use the word inconclusive in a laboratory report standing alone. Our discussion yesterday indicated that they don't use that word standing alone, that they do go ahead and explain further. So while the form gave me the idea that they would use these words alone, they assured me yesterday that that was not the case. And most, like the National Commission on Forensic Science, just issued one of their draft standard statements. And it's more important than ever to put a complete discussion in the laboratory report, because 90 to 95% of cases are handled by plea bargaining. And because of that, it's not appropriate to put an abbreviated report out with the understanding that you'll be allowed to explain your results more thoroughly later, because most of the time you won't get to explain anything. So our discussion yesterday indicated that they do in fact elaborate in their notes about cases where the agreement is less than that for an identification, which I think is good. And then I made some simple suggestions that the word result should be changed to conclusion, because this is what it really is, and give more space available for a written explanation. And the heading opinion should be changed to the basis for conclusion. Again, being a prompt that it's critical to put the basis for whatever your conclusion is. It's inappropriate to just put conclusions in case notes without the justification for the conclusion. Conclusions can be put in the report, but have to be fully supported by the basis for those conclusions in the case notes.
Can I stop you for 1 second, John? I was
Sure.
wondering, for the firearms examiners in the room, the A, B, and C categories under the AFTE range of conclusions, like the subcategories for inconclusive, are you all familiar with that? And that none of this is news, I imagine. It's commonly used, and that how you do the explanation is by choosing from A, B, or C to the extent you can. Is that fair to say, or?
Our accrediting body, ASVAB, does require us to explain inconclusives, so we do put that in our reports.
Same thing. It was highlighted a few years ago through an audit, through NASCAR lab audit, that was an area that we needed to clarify as to the reasoning specific to inconclusive conclusions. And that's been done, and that's how we've been operating since.
Thank you.
And then finally, I made the comment that the form should not be allowed to be seen by the verifier prior to the evaluation by him or her, and that all verification should be done as blind as possible in an attempt to minimize confirmational bias. I don't know whether IFL has designed a procedure for blind verifications or not. Is that on the drawing board?
It is, with our new examiner coming on the 24th, that's something that I've already talked to him a little bit about, and you know who that examiner is. Right now, we use an outside agency to do all of our verifications. We take them to DPD and have DPD's examiner verify them for us.
Dallas PD?
Yes, ma'am. They are not completely blind, but we are looking at trying to implement something along that lines and some of your point. I'd like to also add something else on the worksheet, the inconclusive elimination. It's utilized on all casework that has an inconclusive or eliminated result. It's just not on the complicated cases.
Oh, good.
On everything. So the permutation is only on the complicated ones, but the other one is for everything.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. The permutation chart we only utilize on larger cases which have lots of potential on comparisons. Whereas whenever we have an inconclusive or elimination result, regardless of if it's an individual characteristic or class characteristic elimination, we utilize that worksheet to document the reasoning behind that conclusion.
Can you remind me what the threshold for calling something a complicated case is?
If I'm not mistaken, it has to have 12 comparable items or more of these, or multiple firearms of the same caliber.
Okay. Gotcha.
What if you have multiple firearms of different calibers?
If we have a 40 caliber and a 9mm caliber, it does not require permutation unless there's indications of a caliber mismatch.
I see, okay. I have another question. Do you take only identifications to Dallas Police Department?
No, we have 100% verification requirement now since this particular case.
Good.
So regardless if it's an elimination on individual, inconclusive, or identification, she evaluates the result.
Good.
The only thing she does not look at is eliminations on class characteristics.
That's very good. What's your procedure in cases she doesn't agree with the conclusion that you've come to?
We looked at having a third examiner look at it. And if we cannot come to an agreement on identification or an inconclusive, we go with a conservative call. So if we say it's an identification and there's a disagreement on that identification between the examiners, we'll defer to a conservative inconclusive result if we cannot get that figured out.
I think that's what DPS said yesterday too, right?
Yeah.
That you do the same.
We do. Yeah, I researched lots of agencies' SOPs to come up with a best practice on that type of situation.
Yeah, that's good, thank you. 3, I think we've already covered, haven't we? So we're down to question 4.
Yes, sir.
Any other recommendations or observations with respect to the issues identified in the IFL self-disclosure? And this is down at the bottom of page 4 of my report. To the extent you believe the commission should make any recommendations, should they be extended to other labs in Texas? Why or why not? It's my opinion that the main issue in this case is the failure of the examiner to clearly describe the basis for the exclusionary conclusion. And this failure was compounded by the technical reviewer either not recognizing its absence or not feeling that the absence was important. So I believe, as a result of that the commission is justified in making 2 recommendations. One is that the basis for conclusions reached in forensic casework must be supported by clear and comprehensive case notes. And 2, technical reviewers of forensic casework must have the ability to recognize when an examiner's basis for conclusions, including exclusions and inconclusive results, is deficient and take the actions necessary to remedy the situation.
And these 2 recommendations hold with the additional explanation regarding how the groupings were done and everything. In other words,
Yes.
that the technical reviewers should have gone back and said, well, here's this group 5 and it doesn't match gun 5, but let's go and see if it matches the others, right?
Yes,
Okay.
that's part of it.
You have anything? Bobby? Anything?
So you don't have any other, after your talk, or you, with everybody, you don't have any other suggestion for us or recommendation?
No, I think that pretty much covers it.
Do you think the audit that was done, just move forward and leave it alone? In other words, that even though ideally Ron Fazio should not be the one that did that audit, I mean, what would you do? Would you suggest they consider the cost benefit of sending it out? I mean, I don't even know what to say.
I would, if it were me, I'd be happy with the audit results and move on. And that's because there was really no error. There's no error in examination or no error in misidentification at all. The examiner simply forgot to go back and compare Group 5 with the other 4 guns. And at that time, they didn't have any working sheets to cause him to be prompted to go back and do that. And they've remedied that situation by creating what was it, the permutation sheet that
Yeah.
they can glance at and get an idea and say, oh, okay, I've got this group. And there were extenuating circumstances that caused a gap in the analysis. And when Paul returned, like I said, he was probably there physically, but mentally he was probably somewhere else. So because there was no misidentification, and the bunter marks were definitely not used for identification purposes, they were used for grouping, which actually I think that was a smart thing to do. If I would have been the tech reviewer, and hopefully I would have, maybe next time I would see a page that describes how he grouped those, I would have said, hey, nice job, Paul. Hopefully in front of other people. Anytime you can catch somebody in the act of doing something right, especially in front of other people, take it. Because most people try and catch people in the act of doing something wrong.
I'm pretty
Which
sure
is
he
bad.
hopes you're never going to review anything that he does. That this will never happen again. I'm just saying. No offense to you, John.
No, that's okay.
I'm pretty sure they're done with that. So if it had been a missed ID, then maybe you'd say, yeah, there should be an audit. Or in other words, that you would send them out to somebody besides the original tech reviewer. But in light of what happened, the significance and all that, and they disclosed it. You know, we should keep in mind,
Yes.
this is a self-disclosure, a voluntary, well, sort of voluntary, because the law says you're supposed to do it, but I like to call it a voluntary self-disclosure, because there's a judgment, there's a subjective judgment call that goes into making a decision as a laboratory about what you're gonna bring to the commission for scrutiny. And they brought it, and I think they deserve tremendous credit for that, and in fact, you know, I mean, hopefully it's been I know it's been painful, but hopefully in the end it's helpful, and you've got all these worksheets now, and there were extenuating circumstances that I have only known about for the last 30 minutes or whatever we've been sitting here, so, you know, I think, I understand why you reached that conclusion.
I agree with what you said, and I think the lab did every correction that they needed to do. They had, you know, they went and looked at every cases, and they put the, you know, that sheet with the notes and everything else. Are you
Dr. Bernard?
agree?
I think it's resolved.
The irony is that we will never again have to wonder whether Paul Fazio will catch anything in a laboratory
Oh, Ron
report,
Fazio. Yeah.
because he's been promoted.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
He is now not doing firearm and tool mark examination anymore, so.
So, it seems to me that unless you disagree, Dr. Mosiani, but I think we've gone over
We are done.
everything. Unless the laboratory has anything else they want to talk about.
Anything to add?
Thank you, John. And I would like to publicly thank John because he charges barely anything for doing the work. and did an extraordinarily thorough and thoughtful job, well documented, and, I mean, pretty much did it at least half pro bono, let's face it. I mean, at least half. So, that to me shows a real dedication to helping folks and to improving the discipline generally. And I personally am very grateful for that, and I know the commission, I'm sure you are.
And I mentioned it privately to you that how, well, pleased I was with reading all of these documents that you provided to us and the way that you wrote the report and everything. Thank you, John. That was
You're welcome. My pleasure.
great learning for all of us, and that's, appreciate that.
Happy to do it.
Anything else? No? You can adjourn the meeting,
We can
or
adjourn.
ask for a motion to adjourn.
That's the motion.
Make a
John.
motion.
Second.
Second. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank
So
you.
we are done.